In the modern world, parental rights are treated as absolute and sacred, and Vivian knew exactly how to weaponize that autonomy. She managed to reframe a grandmother's love as a biological hazard, packaging my isolation as if it were a luxury spa treatment meant for my own good. But life isn't lived in a sterile laboratory. When her textbook parenting manuals proved entirely useless against a child's agonizing screams, the flawless boundaries she had so meticulously built began to crumble before the time-tested intuition of a mother who had been there before. Part 1. A Welcome Dinner by the Bluffs. If 30 years as a high school counselor here in Marin County taught me anything, it's this: the things that look the most picture-perfect on the surface are usually the ones with the deepest fractures running underneath. When my son Caleb brought Vivian home to meet me at my cedar-shingled cottage overlooking the San Francisco Bay, my future daughter-in-law looked exactly like an oil-rubbed bronze fixture stepped right out of a high-end organic living catalog. She had a razor-sharp chestnut bob, a cream silk dress without a single crease, and a smile so practiced and serene it made you forget the biting California fog rolling past the windows. "Eleanor," Vivian said, her voice dropping into a register as smooth and thick as warmed-up artisanal honey. "I brought you a jar of raw hand-harvested lavender honey from a small apiary up in Napa. They say it works wonders for the insomnia that comes with aging." I smiled, taking the glass jar wrapped in a neat twine bow. "Thank you, Vivian. That's incredibly thoughtful." But the intuition I'd spent a lifetime sharpening, watching troubled kids hide behind the veneer of perfect straight-A students, quietly flared a warning sign. As Vivian reached over to adjust Caleb's collar, her fingers tightened just a fraction. It was a subtle, controlling grip, just enough to make my son's shoulders tense, though his smile never wavered. "Vivian's already got the wedding all planned out, Mom," Caleb said excitedly as we sat down to the table with the bowls of San Francisco sourdough clam chowder I'd spent the afternoon simmering. "We're doing an intimate ceremony down on the cliffs at Big Sur. Just the people who matter most." "Actually, it's going to be just our closest friends, Caleb," Vivian interjected gently. She set her spoon down without making a single sound against the vintage porcelain. I was thinking the coastal wind and damp air down at Big Sur might be a bit brutal on Eleanor's knees. "I'd hate for you to have to endure that kind of physical strain, Eleanor. We'll take tons of photos and airdrop them to you right away, so you can rest in the quiet comfort of your home without missing out on the joy." I looked across the table at Vivian. She hadn't used a single rude word. Her eyes beamed with pure, almost clinical concern. But the underlying message was as sharp as a razor blade wrapped in cotton candy. "You are not welcome at your only son's wedding." Caleb looked at me, a brief flash of confusion crossing his face, but he was instantly placated by the firm squeeze of his fiancée's hand under the table. He nodded. "Vivian's right, Mom. The trails down to the bluffs at Big Sur are pretty steep anyway." I took a spoonful of chowder, swallowing down a rich, creamy taste that had suddenly turned completely bitter. Vivian wasn't the kind of villain who screamed or accidentally spilled boiling water on your lap. She was intellectual with her malice. She weaponized concepts like wellness, peace, and protecting personal boundaries to systematically excise me from my son's life, packaging my isolation as if it were a luxury spa treatment meant for my own good. Part 2. Invisible boundaries. After the wedding, which I indeed missed due to a clerical oversight with the digital invitations from Vivian's boutique event planner, the Newlyweds, moved into a split-level, mid-century home in the Berkeley Hills, about a 40-minute drive from my place. Vivienne immediately went to work establishing a rigid system of domestic protocols she referred to as their manifesto for mindful living. The boiling point came the following autumn when I spent a month hand-knitting a baby blanket out of the finest, buttery soft merino wool for my new grandson Silas, who had just turned 6 months old. 3 days after I dropped the package in the mail, I received an email from Vivienne. Not a phone call, but a formal, meticulously formatted document with the subject line, Re-Environmental and Developmental Spatial Management for Silas. Dear Eleanor, we deeply appreciate the sentiment behind your gift. However, according to the latest research from the Pediatric Association on Infant Dermatological Sensitivity, unprocessed natural wool fibers are a leading trigger for early-onset respiratory irritation. Furthermore, the deep navy hue you selected falls into a high, stimulus visual category, which conflicts with the low-contrast, neutral color palette we have mindfully curated for Silas's nursery to mitigate hyperactive tendencies. We have donated the blanket to a local shelter. In the future, should you wish to purchase or craft items for Silas, please consult our approved developmental registry linked below. Wishing you a peaceful week. Warmly, Vivienne. I sat entirely frozen in front of my monitor. My fingers still stiff from the nights I'd spent awake in the quiet house, looping that blue yarn began to shake. Vivienne didn't use violence. She used pseudoscience and clinical buzzwords to reframe a grandmother's love as a biological hazard. When I called Caleb, his voice sounded exhausted, tinged with a defensive edge. Mom, look, Vivienne is just trying to do what's best for Silas based on the data. We're modern parents, and we have a right to set boundaries on how our son is raised. Please don't blow this out of proportion. Caleb, I raised you in sweaters just like that, I said, my voice cracking. And your generation carried a lot of unhealed generational trauma because of those old-school mentalities, Eleanor. Vivienne's voice cut in from the background. She was always there, auditing every call. We are actively trying to break the cycle of intergenerational wounding for Silas. We ask that you respect that. The line went dead. I realized right then that I had been completely disarmed. In modern America, parenting rights are treated as absolute and sacred. Vivienne had managed to brand me as an obsolete toxic hazard using nothing but the trendy vocabulary of self-help culture. Part 3. The Storm in the Valley. That winter, Northern California was battered by a relentless series of atmospheric rivers. The streets of Berkeley flooded as the old municipal drainage systems backed up entirely. The lower level of Caleb and Vivienne's house took on several inches of water, knocking out the main breaker and leaving them entirely without power or heat. In the dead of a howling, rain-lashed night, my phone rang. It was Caleb, his voice frantic, punctuated by the high-pitched, agonizing screams of baby Silas in the background. Mom, the house is flooding. The power's out and every hotel within 20 miles is completely booked with evacuees. Can we bring Silas and Vivienne over to your place for a few days? Get in the car right now, honey. The door is unlocked, I answered without a second thought. Maternal instinct and the fierce protectiveness of a mother always rise above personal grievances. They arrived at my cottage at 2 a.m, drenched and shivering. Vivienne, even in her disheveled state, maintained her icy, calculated distance. She kept Silas strapped tightly to her chest in an organic bamboo wrap, deliberately avoiding the plush, heavy quilts I had laid out on the sofa. The next 3 days were a masterclass in psychological warfare, conducted inside my own home. Vivienne turned my living room into a sterile quarantine zone. She constantly followed me around with disinfectant wipes, scrubbing down every surface my hands might have brushed. I wasn't allowed to hold Silas because, as she put it, older adults who frequent public spaces carry an elevated microbial load on their clothing. By the afternoon of the fourth day, the torrential rain had finally stopped, though the mountain roads were still blocked by mudslides. Caleb had to head out to meet with an insurance adjuster and a mitigation crew to assess the damage to their house. That left just me, Vivian, and Silas's relentless, shrill crying. The poor baby had been wailing for 2 hours straight. An infant's cry has a very specific frequency. It can systematically dismantle the sanity of even the strongest mother. I stood by the kitchen counter, watching the living room. Vivian was trying to enforce the strict extinction sleep training method she had read about in some contemporary parenting manual. She sat on the edge of the sofa, her arms tightly crossed, staring fixedly at a digital timer on her phone. Meanwhile, the 6-month-old was crying so hard his face had turned a deep, alarming purple, his little breaths catching in ragged gasps. There wasn't malice on Vivian's face, just the stubborn, desperate rigidity of someone who believed that if she followed the book, the universe had to obey. "Vivian, he's not throwing a tantrum, he's hurting," I said, stepping into the room, my voice low and firm. "I am following the certified sleep training protocol, Eleanor." Vivian snapped her eyes, never leaving the glowing screen. "If you interfere now, you'll ruin the behavioral associations we've spent months establishing. I need you to respect my boundaries." "Look at his stomach," I barked. I didn't wait for her permission. I stepped forward, reached into the bassinet, and gently pulled back Silas's onesie. His little belly was distended tight and round as a drum. He was pulling his tiny knees up to his chest, screaming in agony with every movement. "He has acute colic from the stress, the cold, and the fact that you've been mixing his formula with different bottled water brands this week," I said, looking right at her. "Your let him cry it out method is exhausting him, and if he screams like this much longer, he's at risk for an intussusception from the sheer intra-abdominal pressure." Vivian stood up so fast, her phone nearly slipped from her hand. For the first time, a massive crack appeared in her flawless, composed facade. She looked panicked. She grabbed a heavy hardcover parenting guide from her bag. But Dr. Sterling's book explicitly states that at this developmental milestone, books don't have ears to hear when a child is in physical pain. "Vivian," I said sharply. I bent down and lifted Silas out of the crib. Vivian lunged forward to grab him back, but the piercing, authoritative gaze I'd used to command respect from roomfuls of unruly high schoolers stopped her dead in her tracks. "If you want to validate your parenting theories at the expense of your son's physical safety, then go ahead and take him. Otherwise, step back." She froze, her hands trembling in midair, staring at me in utter shock. "Pot for warm milk and honey." I carried Silas into the kitchen. The first thing I did was click on the gas stove. There is something grounding and primal about a real flame. I heated up a kettle of water, poured it into an old-fashioned rubber hot water bottle, and wrapped it securely in a soft flannel dish towel. "Vivian, get me that lavender honey you brought and some fresh ginger from the crisper drawer," I ordered, not bothering to look back. Vivian stood in the doorway of my kitchen, looking entirely lost, like a child stranded in a dense forest without a cell signal. She clumsily opened the refrigerator, retrieved the ginger and the jar of honey, and handed them to me. Her fingertips brushed against mine. They were ice cold and shaking. I laid Silas down gently on the sturdy oak dining table. I placed the warm, wrapped bottle against his bloated belly over his clothes, then gently gripped his tiny ankles, moving his legs back and forth in a smooth, rhythmic bicycling motion. At the same time, I used my thumb to firmly but gently massage his abdomen in clockwise circles. "It's okay, baby boy, let it out," I cooed, leaning my face down close to his hot, tear-stained cheek. I began to hum an old, comforting lullaby my grandmother had taught me in New England. the same one I used to sing to Caleb 30 years ago. Vivian watched from the counter, her eyes wide. In her hyper-curated world, everything had to be measured in precise ounces, exact minutes, and digitized temperatures on an electric bottle warmer. She had never seen a child comforted by nothing but the intuitive warmth of a human hand and an old-school remedy. After about 10 minutes of continuous massaging, a loud, sustained release of gas echoed through the quiet kitchen. The pressure in Silas's belly vanished. He stopped crying instantly, letting out a long, shuddering sigh of profound relief. Slowly, his heavy eyelids fluttered shut, and he nuzzled his little face deep into the crook of my elbow, finally finding peace after the storm. I scooped him up and held him out to Vivian. She took him into her arms, pulling him so tightly against her chest. It was as if she were trying to fuse him to her rib cage. I watched as the first real tears slipped silently down her cheeks, leaving dark tracks through her perfect foundation. "He's asleep," I said softly, turning back to the stove. I sliced a few coins of fresh ginger, dropped them into a mug, added a generous spoonful of her artisanal honey, and filled it with boiling water. I slid the steaming mug across the counter toward her. "Drink this. Your stress is going to dry up your milk supply if you aren't careful. If you don't take care of yourself, you can't take care of him no matter how many books you read." Vivian sank slowly onto one of my old wooden kitchen chairs. She wrapped both hands around the warm ceramic mug, taking a tiny, tentative sip. The sharp bite of the ginger and the deep sweetness of the Napa honey brought a flush of color back to her pale face. I'm so sorry," Vivian whispered, her voice so frail it was nearly swallowed by the wind rattling the window panes. I thought if I could control every single variable perfectly, I would never fail him. My own mother, she was entirely chaotic, completely governed by her impulses, and she walked out on me when I was 10 years old. I've been terrified my whole life that Silas would inherit a chaotic childhood if I didn't manage every second of it with science. I pulled out the chair opposite her and sat down. Looking at my daughter-in-law, I realized that behind the toxic, controlling, hyper-intellectual shield she put up wasn't a malicious woman at all. It was just a terrified, abandoned little girl. She had built a fortress out of parenting manuals and theories to protect herself and her son, but she had accidentally turned it into a prison that locked out the very people who loved them. "Vivian," I said, reaching across the table to place my hand over her tightly clenched knuckles. "Science is wonderful. It keeps us informed, but life cannot be lived in a sterile laboratory. A child needs structure, yes, but he needs intuition, love and flexibility a whole lot more. And so do you. You don't have to be perfect to be an incredible mother." Vivian looked up at me. The sharp, assessing, defensive glare was entirely gone. Her eyes were just those of a woman who had finally found an exit door after spending years trapped inside her own lonely pride. Part 5. Bridges over boundaries. 2 days later, the county plows cleared the mudslides, the roads reopened, and Caleb drove his family back home to Berkeley. My cottage returned to its quiet, familiar rhythm. There was no dramatic, tearful reconciliation scene. When they left, no grand promises that we were suddenly going to be best friends who shared every secret. We are two American women from entirely different generations, and we both understand that deep-seated psychological armor doesn't just dissolve because of one stormy night. But things had shifted underneath. A month later, a USPS priority box arrived on my doorstep. I brought it inside and cut the tape. Inside was a simple, rustic wooden photo frame. In the photo, Silas was sitting up on a blanket, grinning wildly with his 2 bottom teeth showing, wearing the deep navy merino wool sweater I had hand-knitted for him. the one Vivian claimed she had given away to a shelter but had clearly kept. Taped to the back of the frame was a small piece of heavy cardstock written in Vivian's neat, elegant cursive. Eleanor Silas's digestion has been wonderful this month. I washed this sweater with an organic, hypoallergenic infant rinse, and it turns out he absolutely loves how warm it is. Next Sunday, if you don't have plans, we would love to have you over to the house for dinner. I'm making a roasted chicken using a new milder spice blend, leaving out the heavy nightshades, just like you suggested. You don't need to bring a thing. Just bring your presence. Best, Vivian. I smiled, holding the frame in my hands for a moment before placing it gently on the mantelpiece right next to my late husband's old service medals. We don't need to pretend to be a flawless, picture-perfect family for a social media grid. Nor do we need to force ourselves to share the same roof or agree on every philosophy. Vivian will probably keep raising Silas by her contemporary guidebooks, and I will keep holding on to the old-school intuition of an aging New Englander. But now, spanning the distance between our two distinct boundaries, a small bridge has been built, not out of cold, rigid theories, but out of the lingering warmth of a cup of ginger and honey shared during a midnight storm. Thank you for watching Quiet Revenge. Our monetization is currently disabled. While AI tools may assist parts of the production process, every story is carefully chosen, edited, reviewed, and produced by our team. If you'd like to help keep these stories coming, please consider supporting us with the price of a small coffee. Ko-fi, https://ko-fi.com/The Story Family Patreon https://www.patreon.com/Quiet Revenge Family PayPal https://www.paypal.com/PayPal me/Con Huang Min. Your support means more than you know.